the tinted glass tower in Switzerland that no police force on earth may enter, where once a month the most powerful men alive dine in secret, which a Nazi banker called the only real foreign branch of the Reichsbank, and which saw the crash of 2008 coming and said nothing the world could hear. Basel, Switzerland, a Sunday evening, 7 o'clock. The building does not announce itself. It is a cylinder of concrete and tinted glass rising 18 stories above the railway station, and the citizens of Basel who hurry past it call it, with a mixture of affection and unease, simply the tower. Most of them could not tell you what happens inside. That is exactly as its occupants prefer it. On this particular Sunday, black cars slide up to the entrance and deposit a small number of men. There are, on the most exclusive evenings, 18 of them. They carry no briefcases full of documents, because nothing that matters here will be written down. They gather behind windows tinted just dark enough that no lens outside can see who is at the table. And then, the formal session concluded, those who remain ascend to a private dining room on the 18th floor, where haute cuisine is served with Grand Cru wines, and where the meal stretches on toward midnight, because it is over dinner, long after any stenographer would have gone home, that the real work is done. There is no press. There are no minutes. There is no agenda released to any parliament, any voter, any journalist. And yet, the 30 central bank governors who rotate through this tower preside over economies that together account for roughly 4/5 of the entire economic output of the human race. When they lift a fork in that dining room, they are, collectively, the closest thing the planet has to a control panel for the price of money itself. This is the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, the Bank for Central Banks, the most powerful financial institution you have never heard of, which is not an accident but a design. Now, hold the paradox that makes this one of the strangest true stories in the architecture of power. This inviolable tower is not merely private. It is, by international treaty, beyond the reach of the law. The Swiss police, in whose country it stands, may not enter without the permission of the bank's own president. Its files cannot be seized. Its officials cannot be searched. Its assets, courts have ruled, cannot be frozen, even by governments trying to collect a debt. It floats, by design, in a bubble of legal immunity so complete that it functions like the embassy of a country that does not exist. And here is the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up. This same tower was once described by a vice president of Adolf Hitler's Reichsbank who sat on its board as the only real foreign branch of the Reichsbank. During the Second World War, it accepted gold the Nazis had looted from conquered nations. When the war was won, the victors gathered and voted, formally, to abolish it as an accomplice to the Third Reich. And decades later, its own chief economist would see the crash of 2008 coming years in advance, and the world would drown in it anyway. The tower is still there, every other Sunday, 7 o'clock. How does an institution accused of laundering Hitler's gold survive the men who defeated Hitler and become the secret coordinating temple of all global finance? The answer is a story about a kind of power most people don't believe exists. Real, legal, documented, and completely unaccountable. To understand who truly sits above the world's money, you have to go inside the tower. To understand what the Bank for International Settlements became, you have to understand the strange wound it was born from, because almost nothing about its origin predicted what it would grow into. The BIS was created in 1930 to solve a single poisonous problem: German reparations. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had saddled a defeated Germany with a debt to the victorious Allies so enormous it warped the economy of Europe and, many historians argue, helped light the fuse for the next war. By the late 1920s, the machinery of collecting that debt had grown so tangled that the powers drew up a new arrangement: the Young Plan, to manage the flow of German money to its former enemies. And the Young Plan needed an institution to actually move the payments. So, in 1930, at The Hague, the governments of Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and Switzerland signed a convention establishing that institution in the Swiss city of Basel. Sit with that founding DNA, because it is the first of this story's many ironies. The BIS was conceived as a debt collection agency, a mechanism for extracting reparations from Germany. It was meant to be dull, technical, perhaps even temporary. But something else was baked into its charter, something far more consequential. And it is the reason the BIS still stands nearly a century later, while the Young Plan is a footnote. The bank was not owned by governments. It was owned and run by the central banks themselves, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the great monetary authorities of the founding nations. And its stated secondary purpose was to promote cooperation among them. Buried inside a debt collection agency was the embryo of something unprecedented, a permanent, private club where the men who controlled national money supplies could meet, away from their governments and their publics, and coordinate. This distinction, owned by central banks, not by governments, is the master key to the whole story. A government is, however imperfectly, accountable to voters. A central bank is one step removed. But a bank owned by central banks, sitting on neutral Swiss soil, answering to no single nation, is two steps removed from any voter on earth, and it was engineered that way on purpose. The reparations were the excuse. The club was the point. And the club needed a home to match. Switzerland offered its fierce historic neutrality, the same quality that made it the world's vault. Basel offered geography. It sits where Switzerland, France, and Germany meet, a railway hub from which the central bankers of Europe could all reach the meeting and return home the same night without their movements attracting notice. Come quietly, meet, leave, tell no one. The oldest international financial organization in the world was thus born in disguise, a boring accountant's office for German war debt, concealing a private council of the most powerful financiers alive. For its first years, it did its dull job. And then, the country whose debt had justified its existence fell under the control of a man who would test absolutely what a neutral bank does when neutrality means doing business with the devil. Because the founding members of that discreet little club included the Reichsbank of Germany. And within a few short years, the Reichsbank would answer to Adolf Hitler. Before we walk into the darkness of the war years, you have to grasp the single strangest feature of the Bank for International Settlements, the feature that explains how it has survived every scandal that should have destroyed it. The BIS is, to an extraordinary degree, above the law, not figuratively, legally, by treaty. The foundation is a document called the Headquarters Agreement, concluded with the Swiss Federal Council. Under it, the bank's premises are inviolable, much like an embassy, and the consequences of that word are astonishing spelled out. The Swiss police cannot enter the building without the permission of the bank's own president. If the authorities of Switzerland wished to walk in, to investigate, to seize a document, to make an arrest, they would first have to ask the bank's permission, and the bank could simply refuse. The territorial sovereignty of Switzerland stops at the tower's tinted glass. It goes further. The bank's officials are shielded from the ordinary reach of the law. Employees in its financial operations may not be searched. The institution and its people are exempt from Swiss taxes. And the provision that has proven decisive again and again, the assets of the BIS are immune from seizure. They cannot be frozen. They cannot be attached. When the hedge fund NML Capital, fighting to collect on defaulted Argentine debt, tried to freeze some $300 million connected to Argentina held in the orbit of the BIS, the Swiss legal system, right up to its federal Supreme Court, upheld the bank's immunity. The money could not be touched. A private financial institution had successfully asserted in open court that its holdings lay beyond the reach even of creditors armed with judgments. And the bank does not merely stand outside ordinary courts. It has, in effect, its own. Here is a fact almost no one knows. Until the 21st century, private individuals could own shares in the Bank for International Settlements. Slices of the world's central bank had drifted into the hands of ordinary investors over the decades. In 2001, the BIS decided to end that. It voted to restrict ownership exclusively to central banks and to forcibly buy back all 72,000-odd shares held by private hands at a price it set itself, 16,000 Swiss francs a share. Take it or leave it. Some shareholders did not accept being expelled from the world's most exclusive financial institution at a price dictated to them, but they could not sue in any normal court. Disputes with the BIS go to a special body, the Hague Arbitral Tribunal, which holds sole jurisdiction over such matters. 3 ousted shareholders fought there, and they even partly won, prying loose thousands of francs more per share. But note what the episode reveals. An institution that writes its own membership rules, expels outsiders at a price of its own choosing, and answers challenges not before a public court, but before a private tribunal reserved for it alone. The bank's defenders will say, and it is fair to record it, that such immunity is standard for international organizations, that the UN and the IMF enjoy similar protections, that a body serving the world's central banks must be shielded from the lawsuits and pressures of any single country to function at all. There is genuine truth in that. But truth cuts both ways. Whatever the justification, the effect is undeniable. The most secretive coordinating body in global finance conducts its business inside a fortress no police may enter, keeps records no court may seize, holds assets no judge may freeze, and settles its own disputes in a tribunal built for it alone. Whether you call that prudence or impunity depends entirely on what the bank chooses to do inside those walls. And what it chose to do inside those walls during the 6 darkest years of the 20th century is the reason the victors of the Second World War once tried to burn the whole institution to the ground. March 1939. German troops march into Prague and swallow what remained of Czechoslovakia. And within days, this is the moment the abstract story of a neutral bank turns to something you can taste, like metal. The Bank for International Settlements becomes an instrument in one of the coldest financial crimes of the pre-war era. Here is what happened, drawn from records the institutions were eventually forced to confront. The National Bank of Czechoslovakia held gold reserves, and some of that gold sat in an account at the Bank of England in London, held in the name of the BIS. In the days after German tanks rolled into Prague, an order arrived: move the gold. Transfer it from the Czech account to an account belonging to the Reichsbank, Hitler's central bank. The sum was immense, valued at some £5.5 million in the money of the day. As it later emerged, the transfer order had been extracted from Czech officials under duress, under the guns of an occupying army, and the machinery moved. The Bank of England, at the request of the BIS, facilitated the transfer of the looted Czechoslovak gold into Nazi hands. The governor of the Bank of England at the time, Montague Norman, a central figure in the BIS's own world, was, by the historical record, evasive about the whole affair, unforthcoming even with his own government's chancellor when pressed on what had become of the Czech gold. A portion was sold in London. A large share flowed onward to banks in Belgium and Holland. The plunder of a conquered nation was liquidated through the most respectable financial channels in Europe, with the BIS at the center of the transaction. This was not an isolated lapse. It was the pattern of the war years. The BIS accepted gold from the Reichsbank, gold later established to have been looted from the central banks of occupied Belgium and the Netherlands. It performed foreign exchange operations for the Reichsbank. It continued, in the language of its defenders, simply to do its technical job, to be neutral, to process the transactions that came to it. But there is a point at which neutrality, in the presence of monstrous evil, becomes a form of participation. When the gold in your vaults has been pried from the treasuries of nations being ground under a genocidal boot, we merely processed the transaction is not the defense its speakers imagine. The most damning verdict did not come from the bank's enemies. It came from inside the Reich. Emil Pohl was vice president of the Reichsbank, one of Hitler's own central bankers, and he also sat as a director of the BIS, one of the enemy nationals who kept his seat at the Basel table throughout the war. Describing the bank's usefulness to Nazi Germany, Pohl called it the only real foreign branch of the Reichsbank, not an impartial servant of all nations. In the private assessment of the man who used it, the tower in Basel was, functionally, an overseas department of Hitler's central bank, a window through which the Reich could still touch the international financial system while its armies burned the continent. And yet, the man running the bank for international settlements through those years was not a German at all. He was an American, and what he did and what happened to him afterward is perhaps the most unsettling twist in the entire story. His name was Thomas Harrington McKittrick, and he is one of the strangest figures the 20th century produced. An American gentleman banker who spent the Second World War running an institution that functioned, in the eyes of Hitler's own men, as a branch of the Reichsbank, and who walked away from it into one of the most prestigious jobs on Wall Street. McKittrick became president of the BIS in 1940 and held the post through 1946, across the entire span of the war. Here was a citizen of the United States, a country that from December 1941 was at total war with Nazi Germany, presiding over a bank in Switzerland whose board included directors of the Reichsbank, a bank accepting Nazi gold and executing transactions for Hitler's monetary authority. On McKittrick's watch, by the account of the historians who have combed the record, the BIS willingly accepted looted German gold, carried out foreign exchange dealings for the Reichsbank, and extended the courtesies of recognition to the Nazi conquest of Europe. It kept functioning as an island of financial cooperation between enemies, while the world outside tore itself apart. The rationale offered, then and now, was the rationale of the neutral, that a place had to exist where the financial threads connecting nations could be kept from snapping, that some channel of settlement had to survive the war so the world could be rebuilt afterward. Perhaps. But the men fighting and dying did not see a noble abstraction. Washington saw an American keeping company with the enemy's bankers and doing business with the enemy's central bank, and Washington was, in the plainest terms, outraged. In the corridors of the United States government, McKittrick was regarded by some as very nearly a traitor. And here is the twist that turns a wartime tragedy into an indictment of something more permanent. McKittrick was never punished. No trial, no disgrace, no ruin. When he stepped down in 1946, he was rewarded with one of the plum positions in American finance, a vice presidency at Chase National Bank in New York, in charge of foreign loans. The man some in his own government had considered a collaborator glided from the tower in Basel straight into the upper reaches of Wall Street, his reputation not merely intact but burnished. That soft landing is the whole moral architecture of the BIS captured in a single career, a realm where the ordinary rules of loyalty and consequence simply do not apply, where the worst that can be said of you is an embarrassment that a good job offer will soon cure. This is what unaccountable power looks like in practice, not cackling villainy, but a seamless impunity. But not everyone was willing to let the bank glide free of its wartime record. As the guns fell silent, the victorious Allies gathered in a New Hampshire resort to design the post-war financial order. And one of the first things they resolved to do was wipe the bank for international settlements from the face of the earth. July 1944. In the mountain resort of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates of 44 nations gather to build the financial architecture of the post-war world, the conference that will birth the International Mohammed Fund and the institutions that became the World Bank. And amid designing the future, the powers turn to a piece of the past many regard as unfinished business, the Bank for International Settlements. The charge was laid, forcefully, by the Norwegian delegation. Norway had been occupied, brutalized, and plundered by the Nazis, and its delegates arrived with evidence and with fury. They accused the BIS of collaboration with the enemy, of war crimes, in the language that echoed through the debate, and moved that the bank be dissolved, liquidated, swept into history as an accomplice to the Third Reich. The motion had the most powerful backing imaginable. The United States, the emerging superpower, paymaster of the free world, supported it. President Franklin Roosevelt and his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who harbored deep suspicions of the whole Basel enterprise, were behind the effort. The delegates voted, and the motion to dissolve the Bank for International Settlements was approved. At the very conference that designed the modern financial order, the world's assembled nations formally resolved to destroy the tower in Basel. On paper, in the summer of 1944, the BIS was a dead institution walking. It did not die, and how it slipped its own death sentence is a masterclass in how entrenched institutions survive the judgments passed against them. The forces that wanted the bank preserved went to work. John Maynard Keynes, the towering British economist, an architect of Bretton Woods itself, did not want the BIS destroyed before some replacement machinery existed, and he pressed the case to postpone. The British delegation, bound to the old world of central banking the BIS embodied, refused to give up, and then chance intervened, as it so often does in these stories. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. His successor, Harry Truman, together with the British, suspended the dissolution. The momentum drained away, and in 1948, the decision to liquidate the Bank for International Settlements was quietly, officially reversed. The considered verdict of the moment of maximum moral clarity, when the crimes were freshest and the evidence rawest, had been that this bank should not be permitted to exist. And within 4 years, as the war receded and the practical men who valued it reasserted themselves, that verdict was simply unwound. The death sentence was commuted, not by an acquittal, but by attrition, by the death of a president, the persistence of the bank's friends, and the slow return of a world that found the tower too useful to burn. One narrow ledger was settled. The BIS cooperated with the post-war Allied Commission on looted gold and returned several tons of Nazi gold, plunder taken from Belgium and the Netherlands in 1948. But the institution itself, the tower, the club, the immunity, the secrecy, all of it survived, cleansed by time, ready to be reborn into something even more powerful than before. Because the men who saved the Bank for International Settlements had not saved a debt collection agency. They had preserved the one place on earth where the miners of the world's money could meet in secret. And in the decades that followed, that quiet tower would grow into the invisible government of global finance. Having survived its death sentence, the Bank for International Settlements shed the skin of its origins entirely. The reparations were gone. The war debts were history. Into that empty shell, the central bankers of the world poured a new and far greater purpose. The tower became the permanent, discrete headquarters of global monetary coordination. And again, across the decades, it sat at the exact center of the moments when the world's money system nearly came apart. The reinvention had a human architect, and his career is the revolving door of this whole world made flesh. His name was Per Jacobson, a Swedish economist who became the economic advisor of the Bank for International Settlements in 1931 and held that role for a quarter of a century, until 1956. Jacobson was the man who, more than any other, defined what the BIS would be once the reparations vanished. Not a debt collector, but a think tank for the world's central banks, the place where the intellectual case for coordinating monetary policy was researched, written, and quietly pressed upon the men who ran national money. He was one of the most authoritative figures in international finance for 3 decades, respected enough that his judgments moved markets and ministries alike. And when he left the tower in Basel, he did not retire into obscurity. He walked straight into the very top of the official financial order, becoming managing director of the International Monetary Fund, running, in public and with a flag on the door, the twin of the institution he had spent 25 years shaping in the shadows. The secret bank and the official one were never really separate worlds. They were the same men, moving between the same rooms, wearing whichever hat the moment required. Consider the gold. Through the 1960s, the entire post-war order rested on a promise that the US dollar was as good as gold, fixed at $35 an ounce. To defend that promise, the great central banks formed the London Gold Pool, a secret cartel coordinated among the central banks that pooled their gold to hold the price down and keep the dollar's credibility alive. For a few years, it worked, and then the market smelled blood. In a single frenzied week in March 1968, the pool hemorrhaged close to 1,000 tons of gold trying to hold the line, and on the 17th of March, it collapsed. The dam had broken. Within 3 years, in 1971, Richard Nixon would sever the dollar from gold entirely, ending the Bretton Woods system and ushering in the world of floating, faith-based money we still live in today. And the central bankers who had fought and lost that war over gold had fought it in large part from the tower in Basel. And when whole nations began to drown, it was the tower that quietly threw the rope. In August 1982, Mexico stunned the world by announcing it could no longer pay its debts, the opening shock of the Latin American debt crisis that would haunt an entire continent through the decade. A default of that size threatened to topple the great banks of New York and London like dominoes. So the central bankers moved, fast and out of sight. On the 28th of August, 1982, the Bank for International Settlements and the United States announced an emergency bridge financing package worth roughly $1.85 billion to keep Mexico afloat, while a longer rescue was assembled, with the BIS itself putting up close to $1 billion of the official money. This is the tower's other face, the one it prefers you never think about. Not just a talking shop for governors, but a lender of last resort to sovereign nations, capable of deciding, in a weekend, in a room no voter can enter, which countries are caught before they fall, and which are left to hit the ground. The clearest expression of the tower's power carries a name so bland it works as camouflage: the Basel Accords. Over the decades, from that tower, committees of the world's banking authorities have drafted the rules determining how much capital every significant bank on the planet must hold against its risks, the standards known as Basel I, Basel II, and Basel III. When you deposit money in a bank, the cushion that bank must keep so that it does not collapse and take your savings with it is shaped in large part by standards hammered out in Basel, without a treaty ratified by any legislature, without a vote by any electorate. A committee meets, agrees, and the financial world adopts the rules. Power without a ballot. And here is the fact that should trouble you most, because it cuts through every debate about whether this power is benign. The Bank for International Settlements saw the crash of 2008 coming. Its chief economist, William White, and his colleague, Claudio Borio, spent the years before the catastrophe warning, in working papers and to the assembled central bankers themselves, that the world was inflating a monstrous credit bubble that would end in disaster. White sounded the alarm to the most powerful monetary officials alive at their gathering in Jackson Hole as early as 2003. In 2006, he warned, almost pleadingly, that he hoped it would not take a disorderly unwinding of current excesses to prove they had been on a dangerous path. The BIS was, by many accounts, the one major institution in the world to correctly and publicly foresee the global financial crisis. It had the knowledge, it had the ear of every decision-maker who mattered, in a private room where candor was the whole point. And the crash came anyway, and swallowed the savings and homes and jobs of hundreds of millions of people. The tower's great secret coordinating power turned out to be perfectly capable of seeing the iceberg, and perfectly incapable, or unwilling, to turn the ship. The human face of all this is the meeting described at the very start. Every 2 months, the governors of the world's major central banks fly to Basel for the Global Economy meeting. Some 30 governors, whose economies together account for roughly 4/5 of global output, behind closed doors, explicitly so they can speak candidly without their words reaching the public they serve. Within it sits the inner club, a handful of the most important governors who withdraw to that 18th floor dining room for the meal that runs toward midnight, where their real work is done. The BIS would object, and it is fair to record it, that this is not a conspiracy. That in a globalized economy, central bankers must be able to coordinate. That secrecy in such deliberations is practical necessity, not sinister design. There is real force in that. But hold the reasonable defense against the record: the Nazi gold, the reversed death sentence, the crisis foreseen and unstopped, the shareholders expelled before a private tribunal, and the discomfort remains. Here is an institution that meets in secret, keeps no public minutes, answers to no electorate, sits inside a fortress no police may enter, holds assets no court may freeze, shapes the rules governing the money of billions, and insists sincerely that it is a modest technical utility. The power is real and enormous. The accountability is, by deliberate construction, almost non-existent. And the tower is not finished. Its innovation hub has been building the money of the future, a cross-border platform for central bank digital currencies called M-Bridge, developed with China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Then, in October 2024, just a week after the BRICS summit in Kazan floated a rival BRICS bridge as an alternative to the dollar-dominated order, the BIS abruptly stepped back from the project, its general manager, Augustin Carstens, handing it off to the central banks themselves. The same tower that coordinated the defense of the gold standard in the 1960s is now standing at the fault line of the coming war over digital money, and, as ever, choosing very carefully which side of the tinted glass to be seen on. The tower survived the war it was accused of abetting. It survived the death sentence the victors pronounced. It saw the greatest crash in 80 years coming and could not or would not stop it. Which leaves us, at the end, with the only question that matters. So what in the end is the tinted glass tower beside the Basel railway station? It is tempting, and it is wrong, to reach for the cartoon, the secret cabal, the shadowy hand steering the world from a hidden room. That version is comforting because it is simple, and because it implies that if we could only find the villains and remove them, the problem would vanish. But the truth about the Bank for International Settlements is stranger and more unsettling than any conspiracy theory, precisely because it needs no villains. Everything about it is legal. The immunity is written into a treaty a sovereign government signed. The secrecy is defended as prudence. The men in the dining room are, for the most part, competent public servants who believe they are stabilizing a fragile world. There is no cackling mastermind. There is only a structure, one deliberately built to place enormous power beyond the reach of accountability, and justified at every step by perfectly reasonable-sounding arguments. And that is the real lesson. The thread running from the looted Czech gold of 1939 to the crisis foreseen and unstopped in 2008, to the midnight dinners of today. Power that operates in secret, immune from the law, insulated from the public, does not become benign because the people wielding it mean well. The wartime BIS was run by men who surely told themselves they were preserving something valuable amid the ruin. And it took Hitler's gold. Its economists were clever enough to see 2008 coming, and the world drowned anyway. The problem was never the intentions of the men in the tower. The problem is the tower itself, a machine for exercising power without answering for it. Good intentions poured into an unaccountable structure do not stay good, because nothing, no voter, no judge, no journalist, no police officer is positioned to catch them when they drift. Every other Sunday at 7 o'clock, the black cars still pull up. The most powerful men alive still climb to the 18th floor and dine over Grand Cru wines until the city outside is gone dark. No press records their words. No parliament reviews their decisions. No police force in the world may climb those stairs uninvited. And the people of the earth, whose savings and wages and futures are shaped by what is said over that long dinner, go about their lives never knowing the meeting is happening at all. The most powerful bank in the world was built from its very first day to be invisible. And its greatest achievement, greater than surviving the war, greater than surviving its own death sentence, is that it remains to this day exactly that. A tower full of the world's masters, standing in plain sight beside a railway station, and somehow seen by no one. They meet in the dark because the dark is where the power lives. And they have spent 90 years making very sure we never learn to look up.